The ESEE-5 versus the Busse ASH-1 combat grade. The ESEE is the only knife here that comes with a sheath, so it's the only knife that'll mention anything about the sheath. This is supposed to be set up, this belt clip thing is supposed to be set up higher up, presumably, to hang the knife lower down, but I wanted my belt to actually pinch the knife and sheath, so this goes inside the belt, and your belt goes through here, and it holds it down more firmly. I don't like that whole knife flopping around thing. So that was alright. I was able to set it up to do that with the stock fasteners. And then there's this, the tension adjuster, which you can use. You can slide it up and down. Probably have to loosen it first. And that adjusts how much force is required to take this out. The retention and draw on this sheath is excellent. It's actually an extremely good sheath. Part of the reason I got the ESEE-5 as opposed to the ESEE-6 is that you have a much better sheath with it. And it doesn't dull the edge, which is sort of unusual for factory sheaths. A lot of factory sheaths do dull the edge because some of them are sort of Kydex look or what have you, but are otherwise injection molded or folded as one side and the other side is a flat piece, and the result of that is that you have the plastic interacting with the edge, which you'd say, well, plastic versus steel, it doesn't dull it that much to start, but then you use the knife outside, you know, you got some cut lines in it, some grit gets in there, and over time you basically come up with a sheath that dulls your edge and is a pain in the ass. So here, it's a great sheath. Both of these have seen some use. Obviously, first thing that should be mentioned is this is saber ground, and I never thought I'd say it, but the Busse really makes the ESEE-5 look like a pussy-sized knife. I mean, it's ridiculous, the size difference. Just for comparison, the Game Warden, this is comical. Like, it's, at the same time, people look at the ASH-1 and say, well, it's a huge knife, and while it is quite thick, you can see it's about 1/3 of an inch thick, actually. While it is, as opposed to the ESEE's 1/4 inch, while it is quite thick, it's actually not very big. If you look at one of your sort of kitchen knives, your sort of basic, big leaf-shaped kitchen knife design, chef's knife. This is actually smaller than that in terms of blade length and depth. So why people would think that you'd need a bigger knife in your kitchen than outside, not entirely sure, but that's what I've got to say on that subject. As far as this bow drill pivot, it's a sort of a cutesy feature, not entirely necessary. And this glass breaker, it seemed like a cool idea at the time, and thankfully it's actually not very pointed, so it's not that aggravating to your hand, but it's kind of pointless. Glass breakers that don't use tungsten carbide, or some other form of carbide presumably, or something else harder than glass, really don't break most types of glass very well, because in most cases, if you come to a piece of glass you have to break, unless you're a criminal and trying to break somebody's just house window, most types of glass have additives that make them much more flexible and impact resistant. As a result, with something softer than the glass, you can hit it quite hard and have it not break. And even once you finally do break through it, it can leave a sort of spiderweb and shards, which your hand will then go through, and you can cut yourself quite badly. Something like a carbide insert, Spyderco makes knives with them, shameless plug, perhaps. It doesn't break the window in the same way. A carbide insert, you hit that window, it just breaks into a million little pieces, whereas this, it doesn't really break it. It's basically just something somewhat blunt and heavy that you can hit a window with, but, you know, there are rocks too. So that's a thing. Bow drill pivot, a little gimmicky. I mean, maybe it's potentially useful. I'm not sure how nice it is to be holding something, applying pressure with it, and potentially slip with a sharp thing on the other end. I certainly am not someone who really finds themselves having a great deal of difficulty finding pivots. Obviously, I've not used it, so perhaps I shouldn't comment on it, but it does seem like it's putting wear on your knife that would be otherwise unnecessary. It's also worth mentioning that the lack of 3D texturing on this doesn't make it quite as comfortable as the Busse, although the price difference, clearly there's something to be said there, although this would go up against something like the Rodent 6, I'm guessing, and that does have the contoured handle. Granted, this comes with a sheath, and so the argument goes back and forth. I guess it's a great knife. I like it, you know, but few little nitpicks that must be brought up, I suppose. Also, the other thing I'll nitpick is that the saber grind on this, if you can see it, it's worn here from batoning through things, actually, of all things, but the result is that the geometry is not nearly as favorable as you'd expect. It's pretty thick behind the edge, and it's thick here. You're certainly not going to break this knife. You'd never fear breaking this knife, but it's also not a cutter. It doesn't have great geometry for slicing through things. So if you are, for example, going around gathering sapling, rather than being the, you know, sort of just smack the bottom of the sapling, it may be a bit more of a sort of grab the sapling and hit it once and bend it a little further and hit it again, and then you get through it. But it's a good knife. I still like and appreciate what it is. It's got a great price point, and it still is something you can really count on in the field. No fear. Also, the jimping here. I don't want to pull a nutnfancy and talk about jimping excessively. I'm not a huge jimping fan, but thankfully this jimping, unlike most brands out there actually, which have their jimping too sharp, this is not too sharp. It will not cut into your thumb or the rest of your hand. Let's see some specs. So this, as I said before, this is 1/4 inch thick steel stock, and this is basically 0.32, 1/3 of an inch thick steel stock. Actual measurements of the spine, 6.5, this now includes coatings, obviously, 6.5 millimeters to the ASH is 8.3 millimeters. Behind the edge, sort of at the base, we have 1.35 millimeters as opposed to this 1.8 millimeters. Behind the point, you have 1.6 millimeters here, 1.65 millimeters for the ASH. Handles, 20.6 millimeters thick, and this is 20.4 millimeters thick at its thickest, which, as you can see, it's a contoured handle, which is nice. This is not the Magnum handle, so this is the thinnest handle you can get, and its thickest point is here. For overall comfort, I have relatively thick fingers, beefy hands. So I actually would recommend, for just about all users, the Magnum handles if thickness isn't a concern for you. I like my knives to pack a little bit flatter, which is why I went for the non-Magnum hands. But if all your non-Magnum handles, excuse me, but if all you're looking at is your sort of grip, the Magnums obviously have an advantage. The one thing I'll take a knock at the Busse for is a sort of overall design. When you're swinging the knife, there's obviously centrifugal force trying to pull it out of your hand, and it's very natural to let the blade sort of slide forward and rest on the edge of this. And what that ends up doing is putting pressure on your pinky, which after a while becomes uncomfortable. So this is part of the reason why I even bring up the Magnum handles, which presumably the bulge here that you're gripping will help you keep your hand further up on the blade so you're not actually putting pressure on your pinky. Alternately, I know Busse does this out of bar stock, so there's a limit to how much they can cant the angle of the handle. But if I were doing this design again, I would bring the handle angle down slightly, so you're putting less, you're requiring less grip force when chopping to keep the handle in your, to keep the knife in your hand. And you're putting more force sort of on your fingers here as the knife is pulling out. But yes, those are my musings on this nice design. There is no usable choil on the ESEE. You could claim that this here is something, but it's certainly not something you'd want to put your finger near. Busse is a huge fan of choils, and there certainly is usable choil here. It takes a bit of getting used to when you start out because it just feels bizarre because the blade is, unlike most knives, much thicker than the handle, which is part of the reason I think why it's such an attractive looking knife. So, mass. This is 0.45 kilograms, which is not what you'd call super light, but this is 0.59 kilos in a knife with an overall relatively short blade. What is it, 6.5, 7 inches, something thereabouts. And it's heavy, yeah, it's beefily built, but it does actually have remarkably good cutting geometry, and this is something that I think is not really fully appreciated by the Busse crowd, is that you can use these knives for something other than chopping or batoning through things. This knife, people say you can't do fieldcraft with a knife this big. You know, you can't, for example, dress game, or you can't carve the delicate triggers for survival traps, what have you. And you know, let me tell you, that may be true of some knives, but this isn't one of them. It cuts like a knife that's much smaller. You can really get in there and do detail work. And part of that is thanks to the choil and the grip. The other thing I did notice is that when you're doing something like that, especially if you have another piece of wood and you know you're holding it and you're pushing like that with your thumb, there's very thick spine. It's very nice for that. It's very comfortable to use, and I didn't see jimping really necessary at any point on this. Also, the lack of a point here, as opposed to the newer fusion steel hearts, I find to be comfortable. Again, you know, it seems cool to have a spike on the back of your knife. Somebody who's fallen on a sheathed knife, right? Because if you're carrying it on your hip, obviously you land on it and lean to the side. Where else are you going to go? The relatively blunt point here definitely improves comfort and safety. I guess I'm just not a fan of having spikes on the back of your knives after a few mistakes, shall we say. But definitely great knives. Recommend both of them. I've said before that Infi, it really takes a great micro-serrated edge very easily, better than any other steel I've worked with. So you can polish it up very high, but it's really unnecessary. You do best, you cut best if you finish it to a much lower grit. And Infi, it's just got this sort of weird toughness. It just comes out really clean from something 600 grit or lower. You know, you look at it under the scope, it doesn't have the cling or the mess that other steels do. And it really holds that micro-serrated edge. Normally those micro-serrations you see in other knives, the tips of them are sort of plastic deformations, and you have a problem because they just fold over immediately. And with Infi, obviously it can happen to some degree, but it just doesn't happen to the same degree. You get an edge that stays sharp longer and cuts more aggressively, and it's a huge benefit, especially in a knife of this size. 1095, what else can be said about it? It's a good heat treat protocol. It's used on this 1095. The knife is tough. Haven't chipped the edge yet. Admittedly, haven't tried chopping rocks with it either. But I don't really have a fear of breaking it. Sharpening, again, as with carbon steels, you want to sort of create some micro-serrations. In this case, though, you want to do what you typically do to create micro-serrations, which is finish it to whatever grit you're going to leave the serrations at, and then just go at it just a few strokes on something like a strop or lapping film, what have you, to just take off any of that plastic metal that's left at the edge, and that'll give you an aggressive edge that will stay sharp, stay aggressive for a relatively long time. And of course, as with all carbon steels, 1095 having so few alloying elements in particular, if you really want something stupid sharp, you can really get it stupid sharp without too much work. The corrosion resistance, Haven't had a problem with it. Haven't gone swimming with it either, granted. But it could very much be a problem. I've cut things and some plants and things like that, made the mistake of just resheathing it straight up, and it has pulled up little specks of rust, even though it is protected with Tough Glide. So it's limited by the fact that it has no chromium, but there's not much you can do about that. It's not a huge problem if you're really using the knife, and certainly patinas are prized. Infi, not had any corrosion on at all yet. But either way, corrosion is not the end of the world. You can use a little acid or a chelation agent and just pull that rust right off of it. One thing I will say is this has hypothetically removable handles. Not pulled them off myself. My experience with hex keys of this size is that you can't actually, let's bring it up closer, you can't actually apply torque, as much torque to them as you'd like or as you think you could. So my guess is if you did this too many times, you'd kill whichever is softer, either your hex key or this this screw, Chicago screw style thing. But it is, I guess, nice to know that you could remove it if you needed to. Whereas Busse, I guess Busse tells you that if you have a problem and need to get under the handle, they tell you what size drill bit you use to drill out these rivets, and then you can save the scales and send the whole thing back to be re-riveted when you're done. But yeah, that's just about it. Questions, post them in the comment section down below.